Well, we're here at Anarchapulco, and I'm meeting new people, learning new things. Brien Foerster, lovely to be with you, sir.
My pleasure, thank you.
You've just given an incredible presentation on evidence of ancient technology, and I was fascinated by it because you didn't go off into outer space so much as presenting empirical facts. So we've got the presentation with us. Can you give us a little background as far as how the project began, and then maybe we can go through some of the slides and talk about what you've got?
Sure, well, I've always been interested in ancient enigmas, and growing up I went to university and I studied sciences, so I have an empirical background. And so visiting some of these ancient locations and having local guides, they would tell me, for example, that the dynastic Egyptians built everything. And I saw just by the sense of sheer scale and quality of workmanship that was clearly impossible. So the same thing in Peru with the Inca. There are structures that are megalithic that the Inca could not have done because the stone is much harder than their bronze tools. And looking at the literature, all of the archaeological information says that the Inca did all this work. So I decided to continue studying this with a scientific background rather than an archaeological, more like social science background, I would say. And yeah, there are many other researchers than me doing this, but it's clear that there was the existence of advanced ancient technology in the distant past, and we've been able to quantify that to being 12,000 plus years ago, which of course most people will say that's impossible because societies only go back 6,000 years, but that's proving to be not the case.
Amazing. Well, okay, so why don't we take a look at some of the slides that you presented earlier today, and you can, walk us through and explain some of these things here. What have we got there?
Okay, well, this is Machu Picchu, which of course is in Peru, world famous. And what you're looking at is that wall you're looking at was left that way by the Inca. It was never restored in modern times. And so if you look not all that carefully, but you can see that the upper construction is inferior to the lower. And so that indicates either very qualified stonemasons did the first work and then the apprentices did the second, but no culture would accept that kind of thing. You need continuity in look, and if you look at the gaps in the giant stones, you can see they're very even. So having been there with a geologist one time, she said that's evidence of a massive earthquake of 9 to 9.5 on the Richter scale. And she also said if that had happened during Inca times, then the whole top section of the wall would have fallen down. So she says this by itself is telling you that there was an advanced civilization prior to the Inca existing in the area.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, forgive my ignorance, but is this next slide Stonehenge?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, Stonehenge, of course, is again world famous. But I was there with a local expert who's been studying Stonehenge for about 30 years. And again, the conventional story is Stonehenge was built 4,500 years ago, and that what it looks like now is basically what it looked like then, but it was rebuilt in the 20th century. And when you look at the design, it just doesn't make sense. Obviously, this place was devastated at one point. And so if we go to the next slide, and you'll see this is Maria Wheatley, and she's an independent researcher. Most of the interesting information coming out now is from independent research, not from academics, because independent researchers are free to explore without the tether of government or universities or institutions. So she said, yeah, they did do radiocarbon testing, dating Stonehenge at 4,500 years, but independent testing has found dates of 12,000 years.
Wow.
And she also said that originally Stonehenge was two perfect circles with those lintels, those cross beams going all the way around. And that's logical. When you think of it as an astronomical calendar and or ritual space, you would want it to be of a coherent shape. So being two circles, complete, makes absolute sense. Also, the outer stone circles, that stone came from Marlborough, which is about 25 miles away. And you're talking about the movement of 40-ton stones, more or less. And then the inner ones come from northern Wales, so that's 160 miles away.
Wow, yeah. Did you ever see the Monty Python sketch about perhaps whales built Stonehenge?
Oh, I didn't see that one, actually.
It's very funny. So I've been to Stonehenge. There's obviously your research doesn't necessarily aspire to explain how it was built, does it? It's just looking for the evidence of what it is.
Yeah, I try not to bother trying to explain who did it. She has an explanation, though, that it was a 12,000-year-old culture that were indigenous to England, and that they actually had elongated heads.
Whoa.
Which we find in other parts of the world.
Oh, yes, those sort of stretched out skulls. I've seen that.
Yeah, and she's found that there are some that have been found in the area, and they were buried in what are called long barrows. Those are like long tombs, whereas normal people were buried in what are called round barrows.
So do we know were they human in those long skulls? I mean, that's a whole other topic, really.
It is. They probably were human, but there's the study of their skeletons has only just begun.
Right.
And it's very difficult because the skeletal parts are in, again, institutions. So trying to access that means that the institution has to be sympathetic with your interest. And quite often there's barriers to that kind of thing.
It's interesting how your field mimics what's going on in journalism. Independent journalism seems to be getting us much closer to the truth of events than, any BBC or CNN or anything like that.
Very much so.
Yeah. Now, so what is this next image that we've got here?
This is Avebury. It's one of the largest megalithic sites in the world. It's the largest one in England, and it covers many, many acres. Some of the stones are as large as 100 tons, and they were brought from a quarry 3 miles away, which is quite an achievement. Also, there's evidence, according to Maria, that originally they had very highly polished surfaces added to the stones at Stonehenge. And we actually saw examples in small areas of some of the giant stones. You could see the high polish that was still there. But of course, over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years, any of these ancient places gets trashed by
just rain, even, I would think.
And rain as well. But you always have that with an ancient structure, that you'll have an incoming people who wipe out the indigenous people and deface their artifacts and recycle the stone to build walls and things out of. So you find that all over the world. You never find a site that's intact because it's always been destroyed by somebody.
Just so old. And are there any theories as to how these gigantic stones were moved such great distances?
Well, of course, the conventional story would be log rollers, and there are forests in the area, but to move a 100-ton stone would take 1,500 very strong men, coordinated, being able to pull at the same time. So that's possible, but that's what they always say. They say log rollers. Take into account, though, too, that it's England's a very wet country.
So in this next slide, it seems to show something. What do we got here?
Well, here we have evidence of a flood. Biblical proportions, because of course most people think of the Bible as the reference, but there are more than 400 different indigenous people, tribes around the world, or people, that talk about a devastating flood that happened in the distant past. And it destroyed their world, whether that was an island or a larger landmass. It's always the same story, that a few people survived. Their society was destroyed because the vast majority of people were wiped out in a very rapid period of time.
A Noah's Ark type.
Yeah, that sort of thing, yeah.
Interesting. It's a very nice PowerPoint you've put together.
Thank you. So what we do know is 12,000 years ago, there was a series of cataclysmic events. It was probably from forces outside of our solar system. And so there are different theories as to what the agents of destruction were, which I get into actually slightly further along in this presentation.
Okay. Now this looks very modern. What are we looking at here?
Well, here we're looking at the concept of the city of Atlantis.
Oh.
Now, most people, of course, talk about the continent, but there's more reference to Atlantis, the city. And of course, most people are going to say it's complete fantasy. It was made up by Plato. It never existed. But in the next picture, thanks to modern technology, there's been a recent focus on this, which is called the Richat structure, located in Mauritania. And as you can see, it's a series of rings, just like what Atlantis looked like. And most academics think that it was a volcano that collapsed, which isn't logical.
Or do volcanoes ever collapse?
Not like that. Not like into a flat area. Or
perhaps the same people who were involved with Building 7 had something to do with this volcano.
Could be. Or that it was a meteor impact, or asteroid impact, but it doesn't look like that, because that would create one giant hole in the ground. It wouldn't create a bunch of concentric rings like that. So I just added that in as a curiosity.
Indeed.
And in reference to what Plato was saying, that structure is almost perfectly circular. It's 23 kilometers across, which is the same size of what the city of Atlantis supposedly was. He talks about mountains to the north, which you can see, a plain to the south, which you can see, and it's beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which are, the Pillars of Hercules are just to the north of this area. That's where Gibraltar is. So I just threw that in as a curiosity more than anything else.
Yeah.
But again, independent researchers are the one who discover these things and really do the analysis and actually explore the area, not wait for the so-called experts to do that.
Sure. That's really interesting.
And then also, this is recent. This is from October of 2018. They found a asteroid impact in Greenland. It was an asteroid made of nickel and iron, 1 mile long, and its impact was probably 12,000 years ago. And the force of the impact was the equivalent to 47 million Hiroshima bombs.
Wow.
So that would be a very destabilizing force. It would also likely, since it hit Greenland, which of course is an ice sheet, it would have rapidly melted, if not vaporized, a lot of the ice upon impact. And that could explain, again, the rise in sea level from the so-called ancient flood.
Huh. I see you've got some, is this an artist's rendering of that?
Yeah, that's the size of the impact crater. You can see, I think it's 31 kilometers across.
Wow.
So that's what, the actual asteroid was a mile, and then the impact crater, of course, because of the force, is more in the region of 25 miles across.
That's amazing. And is that like a dinosaur extinction level event kind of thing, or it wasn't in the same time frame?
No, the dinosaur extinction was millions of years ago, but this probably was the equivalent, but more to humanity and the environment of the Earth 12,000 years ago.
12,000, got it.
So I don't think it was responsible for the fact that our Earth is presently 23.5 degrees off vertical, which is kind of strange. Anyway, because you'd think the planet should be perfectly vertical. But I think a series of events occurred that caused destabilization of the planet, causing it to go from vertical to restabilizing at 23.5 degrees.
Wow.
And that would have completely altered the world environment, because you would have gone from temperate forest would suddenly be in the Arctic, so die off, and then every ecosystem in the world would have been heavily disrupted to the point of close to extinction at that point, including humanity.
Now, forgive me if I'm jumping ahead, but is this perhaps something that would have, maybe this is what happened to these ancient civilizations?
Exactly.
Wow.
That's what I think is what happened.
Wow. That's very interesting. So here, I guess I was jumping the gun with my dinosaur question, but...
And then, of course, if you have the bulk of humanity wiped out, you'd have most of the knowledge of the past wiped out.
That's right.
So people would have to start anew. And then we also know that between 12,000 and 11,000 years ago, 120 species of megafauna died out over the course of 1,000 years or less. And so these are some of the theories that that cover this. This is a book by Allen and Dallaire, who say that 12,000 years ago there was a massive, devastating event that happened on the Earth. Maybe in their case, comet or comet fragments hitting the planet and destroying most of the life. And then this is a follow-up book by Barbara Han-Clow. The original title was Catastrophobia, and she believes, again, that this series of events happened 12,000 years ago, and then humanity went into a deep crisis, psychological as well as physical, and so she believes that it took humanity 6,000 years to recover, and that's when we have the rise of Sumeria and the Indus Valley and eventually Egypt. Then also the theories of Paul Laviolette, who's an American physicist or astrophysicist. He believes the same, that 12,000 years ago, a series of deadly events, but he thinks that it was the result of energy erupting from galactic center. That he believes every 13,000 years there's a burst of energy from galactic center that goes across the galactic plane and wreaks havoc, including pulling comets, with it. That this energy went through the sun and caused plasma from the sun to strike the Earth, thus melting the polar caps and melting the ice pack, and again the radiation wreaking havoc on the Earth and killing all of the megafauna. Any smaller mammals could have survived, but the megafauna were just, like the dinosaurs, were just wiped out because they were so large.
Right. And so you're almost like a detective searching for evidence of this around the world in these ancient structures.
That's right, exactly.
Amazing.
And it's important to physically go to the sites rather than look at other people's pictures.
Right.
And so then we have Robert Schoch, American geologist. He was able to date the Sphinx based on weathering at being 12,000 years old or older. And he also believes that plasma ejection from the sun is a cycle that happens every 13,000 years, and that it was plasma that was responsible for melting the ice caps very rapidly and raising the sea level by 350 to 400 feet, like a flood-like event again.
So how close would you say we are to the next 12,000 year hit?
1,000 years.
Okay, good.
Or it could happen earlier.
Plus or minus,
Yeah.
I guess, right? It's hard to tell when you're gauging the weather for 1,000 years.
Well, the universe unfortunately doesn't work like a Swiss watch. So
Right.
it's like 13,000 years is a guess. It could be, it's like anything, like an earthquake in California could be tomorrow, but
Right.
it probably won't be.
Right.
So I summarized all of this in my book called Aftershock
And where can people get that book?
at Amazon.
Amazon, okay. Great. So more ancient sites here.
Yeah, so now we're in the city of Cusco in Peru. That was the Inca capital. And you can see from the photograph that you have three different building techniques in a very small area of space. On the right-hand side, you have megalithic construction where the stones fit perfectly together. You can't fit a human hair in the joins. And then to the left, you can see that that's part of the wall that was reconstructed using the same stone. Then they ran out of that stone and had to use other stone to finish the wall off. So you see that all over Cusco. You see megalithic components and then much rougher work to the side or on top.
So perhaps this was an ancient Trump versus Pelosi battle that
It could be, yeah.
resulted in this wall.
And so this is the first topographical map made by the Spanish about 1535. And the artist or cartographer distinguishes between the thick megalithic walls and the thinner Inca walls. So that drawing by itself shows us that the Inca found an ancient abandoned megalithic city and rebuilt it.
That's amazing.
And then here again is another example. You see the polygonal stones in the lower part of the photo, and then the upper is smaller stones much rougher in terms of building technique. So again, a reconstruction of a much older wall.
Now, without a human in the photo for reference, it's difficult to tell how large these are, but they look huge. And I mean, I can envision this notion of logs and rolling stones long distances over logs and, like that. How do they put one gigantic stone on top of another?
That's one of the big questions, is how is it possible?
To lift it, that's amazing.
Yeah, they're multi-ton, these things.
Wow, that's crazy.
And then here we have Sacsayhuaman, which is above Cusco. If you look at the smaller stones on top, that's an Inca repair work done to the megalithic wall there. Every stone is a different shape and size, and some of them weigh 125 tons.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, how could they move, even now, how could you move 125 tons?
You could with a modern crane, but we're talking people who didn't have the concept of the wheel supposedly doing this.
Wow. Yeah.
And then this is an actual Inca construction. This is the royal palace of one of the high Inca from the 16th century, just before the arrival of the Spanish. So this was the highest level of their technology, much different from the previous photograph, where you see 125-ton tight-fitting blocks.
Yeah, I mean, these look like stones that maybe 4 people could carry.
Oh, yeah, or 2, maybe even 2.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you've been all over the world searching these artifacts out.
Yeah, and still am. Still am.
Nice.
Then we're at Ollantaytambo. Again, this was never reconstructed in colonial Spanish or modern times. So you see the giant blocks of stone and then the much rougher, smaller stones on top. So that's another Inca repair to a damaged megalithic structure.
Wow. This is an interesting one.
And then back at Machu Picchu, you see the perfect curvature of that tower in the background, and then the very rough wall in the foreground. And supposedly the Inca built all of that, but why would you have superior construction right next to inferior? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
No, it doesn't.
And this is also in Machu Picchu. It's a building that only ever had 3 sides and likely never had a roof. And the right-hand side has sunken down by 2 feet. So I was there with a geologist, and she said that was an earthquake of probably 9 to 9.5. And since most of Machu Picchu is a quite crude construction of adobe, mud, and stones, she said that event would have destroyed the entire city. So she says that this example by itself shows you that there was a megalithic presence before the time of the Inca.
And that's a substantial earthquake. I was in the Northridge earthquake in California, which I think was 6.3 or 6.6. And that was an insane experience. The entire hotel I was in shook like I was inside a cardboard box. But the hotel didn't collapse. Windows broke and things like that. But then you look at the earthquake that caused the tsunami that wrecked Fukushima. That was like 7.2, I think. Mm-hmm. So 9.5 is that's massive devastation.
Yeah. And this is another example of a megalithic work that snapped in half like it was a piece of styrofoam.
Yeah.
So that would take a huge event.
So that's another earthquake type thing.
The same series of earthquakes.
Okay, yeah. Gotcha. Wow. Yeah.
So one of the strangest places on the planet is called Pumapunku in the highlands of Bolivia. It's 13,000 feet above sea level, close to Lake Titicaca, but the stone here is of a precision where it's almost laser flat. So the people who lived in this area were called the Tiwanaku people. They were barely Bronze Age, so there's no way they could have done this work. There's also evidence that Pumapunku was buried by a wall of mud that came from Lake Titicaca as the result of a tsunami. Again, likely the same time period.
So this is an interesting point. I mean, how does traditional academia explain something like that? They've got this perfectly cut stone, but obviously no tools that can do that.
Well, they insist that it was done with bronze tools by the Tiwanaku culture, though it's impossible.
Wow. That's very odd.
This is an example of one of the excavations. So they dug down about 2 feet, They found all these stones in place like that. So clearly there was a devastating event that happened. Again, I think it was a wall of mud that covered the whole site. And when you ask them, why don't you dig deeper to see what else there is, they insist there is nothing without actually digging.
But then during the presentation, you said that some independent side scatter radar or something found something.
Yeah, they found chambers that are underground. But it's something that the archaeologists don't want to explore, because then it opens an entire can of worms that they can't explain, because it blows their theory out right out the door.
So wait a minute. So they're scientists, but they don't want to investigate evidence that would open up their field to a whole other way of thinking?
No, they don't. in general.
Wow.
They tend to they don't battle with me anymore. They simply ignore what I do.
Really?
Because the evidence is becoming so profound that they would prefer just to be quiet and continue with their specialty and not get involved in anything controversial like that.
And so this gets into the politics of it.
Oh, definitely.
All these archaeologists, I presume, are funded by institutes, museums,
Governments.
Universities,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so someone like you who's doing all this stuff that's blowing these theories out of the water, we could get conspiratorial and say somebody knows what's down there and that's why they're stopping it, but it's more just people don't want to ruffle the status quo,
Right.
and they'd prefer to say somebody like you, I presume, is a conspiracy theorist, or what sort of pushback do you get?
I simply get ignored. And I think the main reason is because I don't have a PhD in archaeology, they don't want to talk to me. There is that arrogance as well,
Right.
where they'll talk to each other.
Yes.
But somebody who doesn't have the same degree in their field, they don't even want to talk
I've
to.
experienced that in other fields.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, what are we looking at here?
Okay, so this is at Tiwanaku, which is right next to Pumapunku. They're actually the same complex. But this is called the Sun Gate, and it weighs about 12 tons. It was one piece of stone. But you see the fracture line. That, in fact, is a break. So a long time ago, that Sun Gate fell down onto its face like that, and the front was protected in the mud. Then the Tiwanaku people show up 2,000 years ago and re-erect it, and then they do the surface carvings on the top surface like that.
It's impressive carving.
Yeah. Well, these are the bronze tools that the archaeologists have found, and they insist that these are the types of tools responsible for all the work you've seen so far.
It just seems absurd.
It is absurd.
I mean, these look like they're made of tinfoil.
Yeah, it's actually very thin bronze, not even like thick chisels like we have today.
Huh.
And now we move to Egypt. And this is where their labeling exposes interesting things, because the box on the right, which was a sarcophagus, you can see is quite small, very roughly done, and covered in hieroglyphics.
Oh, yeah.
But the one on the left, they insist, is actually older, either First Dynasty or pre-dynastic. And that, I wouldn't call it a sarcophagus, I'd call it a box. It's a lot bigger. The lid and the box are made from the same piece of stone, so they had to have had cutting technology capable of cutting a straight line in granite, which the dynastic people didn't have. And that weighs about 60 tons, with the stone coming from Aswan, which is 500 miles away.
How would something like this be cut today? A water jet? Or
Yeah, well, actually, probably with a giant diamond saw.
diamond saw?
Yeah.
And so this is on display at a museum or something? Is the lid propped up by something?
Yeah, this is the main museum in Cairo.
Uh-huh. Wow. That's something else. You're like a real-life Indiana Jones.
Oh, trying to be. And then more evidence is a box of the same size that's inside the museum. And there you see that cutting line. With close inspection, we can see that there were two circular saws cutting that lid, and that the saws were 6 feet in diameter. And the top saw started to veer off course from the line it was supposed to cut, and it broke part of the lid off. And so whoever these builders were, they simply abandoned the project. They didn't cut it up into smaller pieces to use for anything else. They just went no and then started with another giant block. So that shows the ease with which they were able to cut stone.
Wow. And move stones around.
And move them, yeah. And then here again, this is their label. So it says vases, dishes, jars, and vases out of porphyry basalt diorite, which are stones you can only cut with diamond tools, from the Archaic period, which means pre-dynastic. And this is what these vessels look like. They're perfectly round.
Wow.
They could only have been made on a lathe, and lathes were really, at least powered lathes were only, I think, invented in the 19th century AD. But if there were only 9, as we see here, then you'd say, well, maybe it was people doing it by hand very carefully over the course of a long time. But in fact, these were found in a cache at a site called Saqqara, and there were 30,000 to 40,000 of them.
Wow. It's a lot of...
That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Then we have the Great Pyramid. Most people don't realize that the Great Pyramid actually is an 8-sided structure, not 4 sides. So you see the little indentations.
Yeah.
And also the fact that the Great Pyramid was made from 2.5 million multi-ton blocks, average weight's about 3 tons apiece, and that it was constructed in the course of 25 years. But if you do the calculation, it means each one of those stones would have to be cut, moved, and set into place every 2 minutes. And not only that, geological study has shown that none of the limestone that makes the Great Pyramid came from Giza. It all came from Cairo. So each one of those stones had to cross the Nile River somehow.
So obviously that's not possible. How could they?
No.
And
with that time period, there's no way.
At 3 minutes. I mean, that seems just absolutely, I don't know.
And also in the Giza Plateau, if you pay an extra fee, you'll see that there's a series of large shafts. So this one is about 15 feet by 15 feet. Presently goes down about 60 feet, but it's filled with sand. But what we do know, since I've been underground 4 stories under the Giza Plateau, that there's a whole series of shafts and tunnels that are under the plateau itself. Mm-hmm. And this is evidence of a saw cut with the penetration rate of 3 millimeters per 1 movement of the saw, and that's 500 times more efficient than modern diamond technology.
Wow. That's a little bit hard to digest.
Yeah. Then we have the Sphinx. You see the amount of weathering on the chest and the neck as compared to the face. So it's obvious that the face was recarved, and that the Sphinx was found where it is when the Egyptians arrived about 5,000 years ago.
I've always wondered what happened to the nose.
That was shot off, I think, in the 17th century. People blame Napoleon, but it was actually Egyptians who did it.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was known.
It was done because for religious purposes.
Huh.
Because it's an image of something spiritual or symbolic. And here, what you see is you see horizontal weathering, but you also see vertical weathering. So the vertical weathering could only have been done by rain, and climate models show that the last time it rained significantly in Egypt was 12,000 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's been backed up by 200 geologists. They all who have looked at this say that's water, and that could only, it could be most recently 12,000 years ago.
I like it that we're getting a little deeper now than what you were able to do.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance really.
Yeah.
So here, this is the front paws of the Sphinx, and this is part of the conspiracy cover-up, I guess you could say.
What do you mean?
Well, the wooden, you can see there are stone steps that come down, and then there's this wooden series of platforms. And you would ask, well, what's the function of that? And most people would say, well, that's to make sure that the tourists don't get their feet dirty. But in fact, the central area where the two men on the right are, there is a rectangular part of that flooring that can come out. And when I asked our local guide why you would want to take that out, he said because that's where the entrance to the tunnel and shaft system of the Sphinx are located.
Wow. Okay. So then I presume you were curious.
Mm-hmm. So now we're in the what's called the Serapeum of Saqqara.
Uh-huh.
And that is two tunnels underground. And in it, there are these giant boxes. This is one that actually never made it to its final destination. So this is an example of, again, work suddenly stops in this location for no known reason. I think the Cataclysm was what happened to it.
Right.
And then this is one of the finished boxes. It weighs 100 tons. The lid is 30 tons. The box is 70 tons. And it's in its final niche.
They really liked heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a functional purpose for these? It just keeps it stable, being so heavy.
That would take a long time to really talk about.
Okay.
The main thing about these is that they're so big, and then you see the hieroglyphics carved like very crudely on the surface. But most academics think that the shaping of the box and the hieroglyphics were done by the same people, but that doesn't make sense. And now we're at the Osirion at Abydos, and I'm there for a sense of scale. You can see these are vertical columns, about 40 tons apiece, and they were brought from the Aswan Quarry, which is somewhere in the region of 400 miles away. And this structure was, for some reason, this structure was built underground on purpose. It was only discovered or rediscovered in the 19th century when they found the roof of it. And then they had to cut through in order to get inside of it.
It's amazing.
And then we find lots of core drill holes. That one would be a core drill about that big.
What is a core drill?
A core drill is, in general, that's where what mining engineers do in order to find out the composition of stone.
Oh, so someone modern did that to check it out?
No, it's actually very ancient. In core drill technology was invented in the late 19th century by mining engineers. So you can take a core sample and see if there's bands of gold or whatever in it. But because of the weathering of this one, it clearly is several thousand years old. And the dynastic people didn't have core drills.
Right. This is more evidence of ancient technology.
Exactly. Then we have the Colossi of Memnon at Memphis, or not Memphis, sorry. But that's made of two pieces of stone. The bottom piece is the base. It's about 300 tons. And then the seated figure was one piece of stone, and it weighs 720 tons. The quarry is 400 miles away, and the damage to the front of the back side is almost perfect. But again, another geologist was with me, and she said that's the result of very intense rapid heat exposure. So she said at least 2,000 degrees Celsius struck that colossus and blew the whole front surface off. So that goes in with the solar plasma idea.
Right. Now, I remember you talking about that. So what is that? Is that like a mass ejection from the sun that actually hits the Earth?
Yeah.
Wow.
And actually one did happen 3 years ago. There was one that could have hit Earth, but luckily came from the backside of the sun.
Huh.
But it reached out, whatever it is, 90 million miles. So if it had been on the opposite side, we may not be here today.
The Earth. Wow. Huh. We have these, mass coronal ejections all the time, right? And they disrupt cell phones or whatever.
Mm-hmm. However, once every 13,000 years, it's supposed to happen. Also, there are a lot of underground complexes in Egypt. We were able to walk for an hour underground here at the Valley of the Queens, and the guard who was guiding us said that the tunnel system connects the Valley of the Queens with the Valley of the Kings. So,
So that's where they would bury the dead royalty in there?
exactly. But the difference is the dynastic people found the underground chambers and used them as tombs. They didn't make them.
Oh.
Because some of them are 500 feet long in the bedrock.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Then the unfinished obelisk at Abydos, or at Aswan. If finished, it would have weighed 1,200 tons. And so the question is not only how were they attempting to shape this, they insist they used stone hammers, which would be useless. But the other question is how were they planning on getting it out of the pit at 1,200 tons in weight?
Yeah. What use is an obelisk if it's not standing up?
Exactly. And then this site is called Tanis in the Nile Delta. And in order to get to it, you have to drive through very lush farmland for 2.5 hours. And then you find this hill, which is basically devoid of life. I think I counted 6 plants growing, whereas in the background, you can see the lush vegetation.
Yeah.
And as you walk on the surface, it's like walking on the moon. It's not soil, it's like powder, as if, or I think all the nutrients were evaporated from the soil because it was struck probably by plasma from the sun. This was one of the epicenters of the damage.
I imagine this is one of the few places on Earth where you can actually witness damage from the sun on Earth.
Well, exactly. And it's to some degree off limits. Like this is not a place where tourists go. But we have to keep going farther and farther afield to get more information. So this is a statue where you can see one side of the face has been burnt heavily by heat. Again, at least 2,000 degrees Celsius was involved.
It's an impressive photo.
And this is another statue made of quartzite, and the toes are melted if you look down at the bottom.
Yeah, you can see that.
It's like a candle.
Has anyone else that you know of attempted any project like this, assembling all the different things around the world to try to explain this stuff?
Not with the same approach that I'm taking with it.
Yeah.
And this is also a Tanis. The kind of light pinky color is what quartzite looks like. So that again is the example of very intense, instantaneous heat damage. I only know a handful of people who have ever been to that location. If you mention Tanis, it's like, where's that?
I feel like it's something I heard about in Indiana Jones.
It is, actually, and that's the clever thing about Spielberg is that he studied esoteric stuff, and he always put these little gems into his movies of like really weird stuff that's based on fact. So that's an example. He knew what Tanis was, so he decided, let's use Tanis as a location.
Wow.
And so this is, I think this is the last aspect of Egypt right now. This was only opened up 2 years ago. So you see the Great Pyramid in the background, and then that's the causeway that goes to the second pyramid. So we're going to enter what's called the Osiris Shaft. And this is entering into it. You enter into the bedrock after you pay $3,000 for them to unlock the door.
Well, that's quite an expensive.
A bit of a fee.
Yeah.
And then there's a ladder that takes you down to level 1, which is about 30 to 40 feet down. This is the somewhat rickety ladder that takes you there.
Not for the faint of heart. How high was that ladder?
It's about a 40-foot distance to go down to this level here.
It looks like there's quite a lot of dust in the air.
Yeah, there's lots. Yeah. So it's about 15 feet wide and 35 feet long. And then when you get to the end of that, then you're looking down into another shaft that goes 100 feet deeper into the bedrock.
And so you're taking this skinny little ladder 100 feet down?
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty dangerous.
Actually, there are 2 of them. The original one's on the left. The one on the right is actually, they refurbished it. So it's actually pretty stable. And it's bolted to the wall. And then we go to the second level where you have 6 niches. It's quite a big open space. And there are 2 boxes of about 40 to 60 tons. How they got them in there, I don't know. And this one's very curious because it's made of a stone called dacite. And the nearest quarry for dacite is in Turkey.
So from Turkey to Egypt, this
Yeah.
stone.
At least. If
That's not log rolling.
No, that's not log rolling. And then this is looking down into the final third level. You go down another 60 to 70 feet.
It must have taken all day.
We had 2 hours.
That's pretty fast.
We rented it for 2 hours. And this is at the very bottom.
Now, you touched on this in the presentation earlier. This water is remarkably clear.
Yeah, it is.
How is it staying there and not getting, nasty?
Honestly, I've only been in there once, so I don't know. They actually have 2 huge pumps that are continuously pumping water out of the Giza Plateau area. Because it used to be that when the Nile would flood, the water level could go up and down. But now, because they have the Aswan High Dam, it doesn't go up and down anymore. But where this water comes from, I don't think it's actually from the Nile. It could be a completely separate source. It's a very, very strange, like crystal clear, weird looking water. Very, very.
How did it smell in that chamber with the water?
Oh, there was no smell.
So it's totally clear.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's moving somewhere.
Yeah, you would think standing water inside a stone.
Oh, it would be disgusting.
Yeah.
But no, it's there was no odor at all.
Wow.
So that's something else I'll have to check on in April.
You're going back in April. Oh, yes, I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah, we go once a year. And so this is curious. This is the Luxor Temple. And you can see that there are 2 different angles to it. So this is quite possible evidence that the older aspect, which is the top part, was built at one time, and then the axis of the earth tilted, and then that caused the direction of north, south, east, and west to change. So when the dynastic Egyptians arrived, they built their section according to north, south, east, and west at that time.
And they're navigating by the stars to determine north, south, east, and west.
Sure. Yeah.
So that makes sense. Wow. Yeah. I love these little details of evidence that you're finding.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you go to places a lot,
you notice things.
Always being curious. It's like it's not a question of what's here. It's like, what haven't I seen? And it's all these little details of it. I noticed the first time I went to Luxor, you walk along, all of a sudden it jogs to the left, and it's like, why is it doing this? But then over time, then you go, wait a second, this is dynastic here, and if I go back this way, oh, that's pre-dynastic. Now we've moved to Lebanon. This is Baalbek, the quarry at Baalbek, and that stone is 1,200 tons and still attached to the bedrock. And right next to it, some Russian researchers found that flat surface, and they started digging down, and now they've uncovered a 1,600-ton stone next to it.
And the Russian researchers, are you in communication with them, or they're some Russian university or museum or something and give you the same kind of brush off?
Well, they've supposedly finished, like this was done, this photo was taken just before they had started doing their excavation. So when we go back to Lebanon in April, I'll be able to see the excavation itself and be able to measure the 1,600-ton block.
It's interesting that you're going to all these countries where there's so much political turmoil. I mean, we hear about Lebanon and Egypt on the news. It's always about, overthrowing the government or something. But when you look at these ancient structures, there's something so innocent about seeing that. What's your experience in these countries been like?
Well, a lot of that is hype overblown by governments and also by the mainstream media.
Right.
So if there's any disturbance in a country, in one little area, they'll say, don't go to the country. For example, the only dangerous part of Egypt is the Sinai, where Israel and Egypt come together. That's hundreds of miles off to the northeast. And also in Lebanon, the conflict area is hundreds of miles away from Baalbek. So you don't.
And everyone's, you're Canadian and American, and everybody's all right with that. You have a good time there.
Oh, sure.
That's nice to know.
And this is at Baalbek itself, which is a mile from the quarry. And those are 3 stones that fit tightly together, each weighing 1,000 tons.
It's amazing. It looks like a castle or something.
And there are several blocks as well that weigh probably 30 or 40 of them that weigh 800 tons. And this is another wall section of 800-ton blocks. You can see the size of the people
800
walking along.
tons.
And then what is above that is the later Roman construction. So most people will say the whole thing was done by the Romans, but clearly the Romans found Baalbek damaged and decided to rebuild it.
So one of these stones weighs like twice as much as a 747 or something.
Yeah, something like that, or more than 400 automobiles, each one.
Wow.
Oh, now we're at Petra in Jordan. This is the famous treasury from the Indiana Jones film.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't do any research about this place before I went. I don't know why I didn't, but what I was shocked by is that there's this thing called the Seek, which is a passageway that you have to walk through to get to the treasury. I thought it would be like 200 yards long, and it turned out that we walked for a mile to get to it. And it's like, then when we got to this, I said, how much farther can we walk through Petra? And he said, oh, another 6 miles. So this is 1% of what Petra is.
Now, from here, it looks like it's just carved out of the stone face.
It is.
Wow.
And also recent research too, like you can walk, you're not allowed to anymore, but it's a hollow structure. You can walk into that chamber where that giant door is, and the chamber is 300,000 cubic feet in size.
All carved out of that mountain.
Yep, all carved right into the mountain. Yeah.
That's just amazing to imagine how that could be done. I mean, even today, it just seems so...
Yeah, today it's possible, but it would take a long time and would be a waste of time because of the amount of effort. Yeah. And then after you pass the treasury, then you walk past all these chambers that just keep going for miles. So it's not like there's one.
Right. They had obviously some technique of doing this.
Yeah, and we see machine marks. So it's clearly machining technology. But there are hundreds of these recesses. And the stone is quartzite. It's very hard.
Wow.
And there are so many of them, they even turned 2 of them into modern-day bathrooms.
That's pretty good.
And this is another one of the chambers. Again, it's 300,000 cubic feet in size. And the diagonal marks that you see on the walls, those are the cutting tool marks that were left behind by the machines that were in there doing the work.
And what does the ceiling tell us here?
Well, the ceiling it's a beautiful quartzite with all sorts of minerals in it, but as well, all the machine marks we can see there as well, from one end to the other. So how that was achieved, it wasn't done by primitive tools. And after 7 miles, you get to this structure, again, carved into the bedrock. And that chamber is probably, again, another 300,000 cubic feet.
That's amazing. This one looks even more perfect.
That's actually in Saudi Arabia, but It's the same technique. And there's another location called Little Petra, which is about a half-hour drive from Petra, and it's exactly the same technique. So this stretches from Jordan into Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is not very difficult to access, but photographs like this that are taken by tourists show that whoever did this work covered a huge amount of territory.
And all of these photographs are taken by you, right?
No, I've never been to Saudi Arabia, but I can tell just by looking at it that it's exactly the same technology.
Got it.
Like the same designs, same elements. Why it would be done in the middle of the desert, who knows? And then when we go to Jerusalem, then under the Western Wall, the tunnels that they've uncovered there, which I'm going to in March 2020, that stone block weighs 500 to 600 tons. And I don't think it's the only one. And there are lots of megalithic walls like this in Greece.
What does megalithic mean exactly?
Megalithic means like giant stone.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And then lots of stuff in Italy, especially on the south or on the west coast. You see again these pocket or these chambers, and this is in Osaka, Japan.
Oh, wow. So really all around the world.
Yeah, and also in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo has stones of that size too.
Yeah, we can tell we're somewhere else now.
This is Easter Island.
Ah, yes. So I've always been fascinated by those giant heads, and here we go. So what's the story with the giant heads on Easter Island?
Well, there are 950 of them.
Wow.
And most people think they're just heads, but they're actually full bodies.
Oh, buried. I remember they discovered that very recently, right?
The first one was discovered in the 1950s by Thor Heyerdahl. But recently, because it was the 1950s, he brought the first archaeological expedition to Easter Island. He was allowed to do whatever he wanted, and he decided to dig down, and they uncovered the full body. And recently, they've been doing more of it.
And why would they not want to dig down and reveal all of them?
Well, they say because of weathering problems, that it would cause, they want to preserve them the way they are. So when they do an excavation, then they have to rebury the figure again.
Where is Easter Island? South Pacific?
Yeah, it's about 2,000 miles off the coast of Chile.
And has anyone offered any explanation of what these things are or what they're doing there?
Well, the standard idea is that each one is an ancestor, so that when a high chief would die, then one of these would be made in his likeness, and then it would be erected on a platform. His bones would be buried underneath it, and then for the rest of time, the ancestor would look in at the village as a caretaker.
And any explanation as to why they're buried, just so heavy and the soil is soft?
No, they don't give a really good explanation why they do, but I was there with Robert Schock, again, the weathering expert, and he said that he thinks over the course of thousands of years, they became buried up to their necks, or in the case of that one, up to the nose. So just the sloughing off of volcanic material from the mountainside coming down.
There you go. That makes sense.
And then this is when they started to do the actual excavations. So that's digging down somewhere in the region of 4 feet.
Interesting markings on the back.
Yeah, no one's been able to translate what that is.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wow. And these are photographs that you took or photographs you downloaded?
Downloaded, yeah, because they've been done over like 10 years ago. This was taken in the 1950s.
Wow.
So that's Thor Heyerdahl's crew unearthing the first one. And immediately it was reburied again. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. So if you go there today, you'll see it's up to here.
Huh.
But again, they say, well, weathering would be a problem. I don't think that's the real reason. I think they just, it's just like, doesn't fit the standard story of what the Polynesians were capable of. And obvious somebody was there before the Polynesians.
It's weird that nobody wants to find out more about that. Well, no, nobody but you.
Yeah. Well, that's why I give interviews so that the general public can see. And even in Mexico, there's some interesting artifacts. These are obsidian things that had to have been turned on lathes. And supposedly the Olmec people made these. The Olmec weren't even a Bronze Age. They were a Stone Age culture. They weren't even a Bronze Age culture. And those things are perfectly circular.
Yeah.
And then these are more objects like that. You can see they're perfectly circular. They had to have been turned on lathes. And I was fortunate to be with American mechanical industrial engineer, manufacturing engineer, and I said, David, come here and look at these. And he went, wow. I said, could those be made by hand? And he said, no way.
Yeah.
So
two perfectly circular.
Perfectly circular. Yeah.
Got to be spun. There's more complex shapes.
And that's a look at the side view of them. So they're like spools.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. Very interesting. This looks like more Mexican ruins.
And then other stuff in Mexico isn't as obvious, but you can see that staircase is made of quite massive blocks compared to the rough work on the left side and the right side. So there's subtle aspects in Mexico that some of these places are much more ancient than the Maya or the Olmec or the Aztec. So that's Chichen Itza. And this is Mitla in Oaxaca. There are, I think, 20 of these giant columns of basalt that don't fit in with the landscape at all. So they're about 10 feet tall. And then that's a 6-ton block on top of quite a roughly made wall. There are at least 10 of those.
And has this one collapsed?
Well, I think it's like this. They found the giant blocks there, and then the Zapotec people who came later, they did reconstruction and somehow were able to lift those back up to use as cross beams, but they didn't make them. So this one weighs about 10 tons, and the biggest one I found was 18 tons.
Wow. Well, I think that's it for the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
It's fascinating photographs, Brien.
Thank you.
So what do you see as the end game for your research, or is there one?
It's just to expose to the general public these anomalies that don't make sense according to the standard story we've been given, that all cultures started out primitive and then became society and then wound up being who we are today. It's more that there was a profound series of civilizations in the distant past who had capabilities, in some cases, beyond what we have, and were devastated by cataclysmic events. And I just want to show that the human story goes back much farther than what we've been told, and is much more complex than what we've been told.
It's really fascinating. So will you write another book?
I've written 36 so far.
Holy cow, I had no idea.
Yeah, and I've got, I think, 1,070 YouTube videos.
Wow.
So I'm starting to slow down now. I don't have to race off all the time, but I love visiting these places. We come to Mexico once a year with a group to show them the evidence. Then we go to Egypt once a year to show them the evidence, and 3 times in Peru and Bolivia to do that, and then going to Turkey and starting to focus on places in the Middle East that I haven't been to that aren't too dangerous.
Right. And so is this your first time at Anarchapulco, or have you been to this before?
No, yeah, this is my first time. I was invited last year, but I wasn't able to make it. And I'm very happy I was able to make it this time. It's great. And it's just before our 10-day tour of ancient sites, so they both fit in perfectly together.
Great. Well, I'm really glad we were able to meet up and talk, and I got much more information now. You get to go through the presentation really fully. So
yeah, it's great. Thank you.
It was great. Well, thank you very much, Brien. Is there a website or something where people can go to see more about you? Yeah,
my website is hiddenincatours.com, and my books are on Amazon, and my YouTube channel is Brien Foerster, if they spell my name right, which is, you can see there with an E, and then Foerster, which is...
I'll put a link there so people can click to it easily.
Yeah.
And then perhaps in the future we could talk more about the elongated skulls and some more of the research that you've done.
Sure, yeah, because that's ongoing as well. We're getting into DNA testing and stuff now, which again academics are not doing. So it's, the future, as you said, the future of journalism is with the independent person. The future of these historical studies, again, is with the individual, not with institutional mindset and funding and all that kind of thing. We're in a new age, and it's good.
Yeah. Well, I'm so pleased that you and I could meet and bring these two things together.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Well, thank you so much, Brien.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of Anarchapulco, and I'll speak to you soon.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks for watching, everybody.